The train screamed into the station, a shriek of tortured metal and steam that ripped the dusty silence of the prairie town right in two. Evelyn Grace stepped onto the platform. Her boots were polished so bright you could see the worried sky in them. Her gloves were bone white. Her whole life was packed into a single leather trunk and a single creased letter she held against her chest like a shield. She hadn't eaten a full meal since Denver, but the hunger in her stomach was nothing compared to the hunger in her heart. This was it, the first day of the rest of her life. She scanned the faces in the small crowd. A few ranch hands, lean and mean, watched her like wolves watch a lamb. Some town women whispered behind their fans, their eyes like chips of ice. A couple of barefoot kids stared at her parasol as if it were a fallen piece of the moon. And then she saw him, Roland Tate. He was bigger than his photograph, thicker. A bull of a man stuffed into a Sunday suit, his face red and his eyes hard as river stones. He wasn't walking toward her. He was swaggering, a smirk already twisting his lips. This was the man who had promised her a new life, a home, a future. Evelyn lifted her chin, forced a smile she didn't feel, and stepped forward. "Mr. Tate," she said, her voice clear and warm. "I'm Evelyn." He stopped. His eyes crawled over her, from the brim of her hat to the tips of her worn-out boots. He wasn't looking at a person. He was inspecting livestock, and the smirk on his face just vanished. "Is this some kind of a joke?" he grunted. The words hit her like a slap. "No, sir," she stammered, her smile faltering. "I'm here in response to your advertisement, your letter." "You ain't what I was expecting," he said, his voice dropping into a low growl. Her hands started to shake. I have the letter right here. See?" She fumbled with the paper, unfolding it. The words she'd memorized were printed right there. Seeking a God-fearing woman of strong character for frontier marriage. Must be honest, gentle, and able to read. "That's me," she whispered, a desperate plea in her voice. He looked at her hands, soft and clean despite the long journey. "You look like you've never done a day of real work in your entire life." "That's not true," she said, the words barely audible. "I cared for my mother until she passed. For 5 years. I bathed her. I fed her. What?" he barked, leaning in. "I need a woman who can break a horse, not read poetry." He turned his head and spat a brown stream of tobacco juice on the platform, inches from her shoe. "You ain't cut out for this place." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Cruel, sharp laughter that pricked her skin like needles. Evelyn's face burned with a shame so hot it felt like it could peel her skin off. Roland Tate turned his back on her, ready to walk away, ready to discard her like a piece of trash. "I came all this way," she cried out, her voice cracking with a panic she couldn't control. "I sold everything I owned. I left my family's graves behind. Please, sir, just give me a chance to prove myself." He paused, but he didn't turn all the way around. He just glanced over his shoulder, his eyes filled with a disgust that went bone deep. "You're too good for your own good," he sneered. "And that's the real problem." And then he was gone. The crowd began to drift away, the whispers and chuckles fading into the dry prairie wind. The station clock ticked, each second a hammer blow against her heart. Evelyn's hands fell to her sides, the letter fluttering from her numb fingers and landing in the dust like a dead bird. She bent to pick it up, but her knees buckled. The world tilted, the faces of the remaining townsfolk blurring into a hateful smear. "City girls don't last long out here," a woman's voice cut through the haze, sharp and unforgiving. A saloon girl in a gaudy red dress sauntered past, not even bothering to look at her. "Might as well get back on that train before it leaves you for good." "I have nowhere to go," Evelyn whispered to the empty air. She forced herself to stand, to walk. She didn't know where she was going. Her boots felt like lead weights, thudding on the wooden planks. Past the station master, who wouldn't meet her eyes. Past a little boy with a dirty face who held out a piece of jerky, his expression a mixture of pity and fear. She tried to thank him, but her throat was a knot of unshed tears. She didn't let herself cry. Not until she was at the far edge of town, hidden behind the cattle yard, surrounded by the smell of hay and manure. There, in the dirt, she finally folded in on herself. It wasn't a loud sob. It was a silent, violent shaking, the sound of something precious inside of her, breaking clean in two. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She had done everything right. She had prayed. She had kept herself decent, pure, good. Too good, he'd said, as if decency were a disease, as if being kind was a sin in this God-forsaken place. The prairie stretched out before her, endless and empty, uncaring. The sun beat down, baking the hope right out of her. And that's when she heard a low whistle. It wasn't the train. It was a sound on the wind. She wiped her eyes, her resolve hardening like clay in the sun. She had survived worse than this. She would find work. She would dig ditches with her bare hands if she had to. She would not be broken. As she turned back toward the town she already hated, she saw him. A man. He was standing by the water trough, perfectly still, just watching her. His hat was pulled low, his coat was old, and dust clung to him like a second skin. He wasn't smirking like Roland. He wasn't laughing like the others. His face was quiet. Still, he just watched. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs as she walked past him, bracing for an insult, a sneer, anything. But there was nothing. Only silence, and the unnerving feeling of his eyes on her back. She made it another block before her legs finally gave out. She didn't faint. She just crumpled, folding onto the edge of a weathered wooden porch like a discarded doll. She tried to push herself up, but her arms had no strength. A door creaked open. Suddenly, the silent man was there, crouched beside her. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet and rough, like worn leather. "You hungry?" She could only manage a tiny nod. He helped her up. His hands were strong, calloused, but gentle. He didn't ask her name. He didn't offer his. He simply opened the door to his small, plain cabin and guided her inside. The room was cool and dim. A tin kettle sat on the stove. A single shelf held a few worn books. He poured her a cup of water, and she drank it like a woman dying of thirst. When she was done, she looked up. He was standing by the window, watching the sun bleed across the horizon. "I'm sorry to be a burden," she whispered. "You ain't," he said, not turning around. Do you always bring strangers home?" she asked. "No." The word was flat, final. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. "My name is Evelyn." He gave a slow nod. A long moment passed before he spoke again. "Lucas." She looked at him, really looked at him. His hands were clasped in front of him, one thumb rubbing the other over and over. A nervous habit, or maybe a grieving one. "I should go," she said, though she had no idea where she would go. Finally, he turned to face her. His eyes weren't cold, but they weren't warm either. They were searching, as if trying to read a story written on her soul. "There's stew on the stove," he said. "You're welcome to it." She ate while he stood on the porch, his arms crossed, a silent sentinel in the deepening dusk. They didn't speak another word that night. But as Evelyn lay on the simple cot he'd offered her, something in her chest, that broken, splintered thing, began to feel quiet. And she looked out the window at the dark shape of the man who hadn't laughed, who hadn't judged, who had simply watched. And she couldn't shake the terrifying thought that he hadn't just seen a stranger in distress. He had seen exactly what he was looking for. Evelyn woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Pale morning light filtered through a tattered quilt tacked over the window frame. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The train, the sneer on Roland Tate's face, the laughter, the collapse, and the silent man. Lucas. She swung her legs over the side of the cot and saw a basin of warm water on the floor. Beside it, a clean cloth and a bar of soap. Someone had thought of her comfort. A pang of something sharp and unfamiliar went through her. No one had done that for her in years. When she entered the main room, he was already at the table, eating. He didn't look up, just pushed a steaming mug of coffee toward the empty chair. It was a simple meal. Bacon, hard bread, a boiled egg. But to Evelyn, it smelled like a feast. "I can earn my keep," she said quickly, her voice still rough from sleep. "I can cook, I can sew, I can read and write." "You need to eat," he cut her off without raising his eyes from his plate. His voice was low, gravelly, as if he rarely used it. She sat, unsure of what to do. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was just there, like the dust, like the wind. He finally glanced at her. "You slept near 12 hours. "I suppose I needed it," she admitted. They ate without speaking for a long time. Lucas wasn't like the other ranchers she'd seen. He had the build, the calloused hands, but he lacked the swagger. He moved with a quiet purpose, as if every motion was measured and weighed. "You live here all alone?" she finally asked. He gave a single sharp nod. "For how long?" "6 years." She hesitated, then asked gently, "Since your wife passed?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Another nod. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said softly. "She had a name." The words were clipped, sharp. He stood abruptly and threw the door open, letting the blinding morning sun flood the small cabin. "Miriam." He said the name like it was a stone in his mouth. "Fever took her, left the place quiet. I decided to keep it that way." She followed him out onto the porch, her coffee cup warming her cold hands. The land rolled away in every direction, a sea of pale gold grass under an endless blue sky. It was a beautiful, lonely country. "You planning on staying?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I don't have any plans anymore," she confessed. He turned and studied her face, his gaze intense. "I could use the help," he said finally. "Planting season, and chores. But if you stay, it's gonna be real work." "I'm not afraid of work." His gaze didn't waver. "I don't mean sweeping floors and making soup. I mean hauling feed sacks till your back breaks and hammering fence posts till your hands bleed. I mean burying the chickens when the coyotes get them." A flicker of the old fire returned to her. "I'll bury the coyote if I have to," she said, her chin lifting. For the first time, a sound that might have been a chuckle escaped his lips. It was dry and rusty, but it was there. All right then. Their life fell into a strange rhythm. He worked the land from sunup to sundown. She tended the cabin, the garden, the chickens. They were two ghosts haunting the same small space, their days measured by chores and the setting sun. They spoke of the weather, the cost of seed, the way the stars looked on a clear night. They never spoke of Roland Tate. They never spoke of Miriam. They never spoke of the future. But one evening, as she was reading aloud from one of his worn books, he stopped her. "Where did you learn to read like that?" he asked, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "My mother taught me. She said a lady's voice should be her finest garment." He was quiet for a long moment. "I was at the station that day," he said, his voice dropping low again. "Not by chance." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She put the book down. "What do you mean?" He finally looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable in the flickering lamplight. "I was waiting." cold dread trickled down her spine. Waiting for what? For you, he said. The air in the room grew thick, heavy. She could hear the blood pounding in her ears. This quiet, solitary man. He had been waiting for her specifically. Why? How could he have known she was coming? I don't understand, she whispered. Lucas leaned forward, his calloused hands resting on the rough wooden table between them. The lamplight carved deep shadows into his face, making him look older, harder. I knew Roland was expecting a mail-order bride, he said, his voice a low rumble. I read the advertisement myself. But why would you care? Evelyn asked, her mind racing. Why would you be there? He held her gaze, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something raw and dangerous in his eyes. A fire banked low, but still burning hot. Because Roland Tate, he said, each word landing like a stone, is my brother. The confession hung in the air, a shocking, impossible truth. Brother? This quiet, deliberate man and that arrogant, cruel brute. They couldn't be more different. It was like comparing a weathered oak to a poison vine. Evelyn stared at him, speechless. My younger brother, Lucas clarified, his voice laced with an ancient bitterness. He got the main ranch when our father died. He got everything. And you, she whispered, what did you get? This, he said, gesturing around the small, sparse cabin. A patch of dry land and a long memory. Roland, he has a darkness in him. Always has. He doesn't want a wife to love and cherish. Lucas's eyes hardened. He wants a slave, someone with no family, no connections, someone who will disappear without anyone coming to look for her, someone he can work to death and bury in an unmarked grave. A wave of nausea washed over Evelyn. The public humiliation at the station suddenly seemed like a blessing, a miraculous escape. Roland hadn't rejected her because she was too delicate. He'd rejected her because she wasn't broken enough. He'd seen the spark of defiance in her eyes, the strength in her spine, and he knew she wouldn't be an easy victim. He wanted someone whose spirit was already crushed. She wasn't just an unwanted bride. She was a survivor. He would have killed me, she breathed, the horror of it settling deep in her bones. Slowly, Lucas said, his voice grim. He would have snuffed you out like a candle, bit by bit, until there was nothing left. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the frantic beating of Evelyn's heart. This changed everything. Her random act of misfortune was actually a calculated act of evil. And this man, this stranger, had known it all along. Lucas leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. This town, it's his town. The sheriff is in his pocket. The people are scared of him. There's nowhere for you to go where he can't reach you. He let that sink in, let the tendrils of fear wrap around her again. But there is one thing he wouldn't dare to do, Lucas continued, his voice dropping even lower. There is one line even a man like Roland won't cross. What is that? She asked, her voice trembling. He looked her straight in the eye, his gaze so intense it felt like he was looking right through her. He wouldn't dare touch his brother's wife. Evelyn's breath hitched. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting a solution, he said flatly. A deal. You stay here. You tell everyone you are my wife, in name only. A piece of paper and a shared roof. It's a lie, but it's a lie that will keep you alive. It's the only armor you have. Her mind reeled. Marry a man she'd known for less than a week. A man who was a ghost, a brother to the monster she'd just escaped. Live a lie in this hostile, unforgiving place. It was insane. But then she thought of Roland's cold eyes, the laughter of the crowd, the vast empty prairie that promised nothing but a lonely death. She looked at Lucas, at the strange, quiet strength in his face. He was offering her a shield, a dangerous, uncertain shield, but a shield nonetheless. He would never believe it, she whispered. He'll have to, Lucas said, because I'll make him. And in the depths of his dark eyes, Evelyn saw a promise of a reckoning that had been brewing for a very long time. This wasn't just about saving her. This was about something else entirely. This was about revenge. The lie began the very next morning. It was a fragile, unspoken thing that settled over the small cabin like a shroud. They were no longer a man and a woman. They were a husband and a wife. The words were never said between them, but the pretense was there in every shared meal, every quiet evening. It was a dangerous game, and Evelyn felt the weight of it with every breath. 5 days after her arrival, the game was put to the test. 2 riders appeared on the horizon, kicking up a cloud of dust that was visible for miles. Evelyn's heart leaped into her throat. Lucas, who had been mending the corral gate, didn't even flinch. He just kept working, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he'd been expecting them all along. They reined in their horses a few feet from the porch. One was a thin man with a nose like a hawk and teeth stained yellow from tobacco. The other was broad and meaty, a man who looked like he solved all his problems with his fists. Evelyn recognized them from the train station. They were Roland's men. "Afternoon, Lucas," the thin man called out, his voice slick with false friendliness. Lucas finally looked up, his face a stony mask. He just nodded. "Folks in town are talking," the man continued, pushing his hat back. "Got a concern about this woman, Evelyn Grace. We all heard she was promised to your brother." Lucas wiped his hands on a rag, his movements unhurried. "She was rejected," he said, his voice flat. "Maybe so," the thin man sneered. "But it's a matter of reputation. A contract's a contract. It looks bad, you keeping another man's intended." Lucas's eyes, cold and hard as steel, shifted from the man to Evelyn, who stood frozen in the cabin doorway. Then he turned his gaze back to the riders. The air crackled with tension. "She's my wife," Lucas said. The words, so simple, so quiet, hit with the force of a gunshot. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The lie was real now, spoken aloud, thrown like a gauntlet at the feet of his enemy. The thin man blinked, thrown off balance. "Is that so? When did this happen?" "Morning after she arrived," Lucas said without a flicker of emotion. The second man snorted. "You got papers to prove it? A preacher's signature?" "I don't need a piece of paper to speak the truth on my own land," Lucas said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. He took a single step forward, and the horses shied back nervously, sensing the shift in him. He was no longer a quiet rancher. He was a predator defending his territory. The thin man held up his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. All right. A man's free to do as he pleases out here. Just don't bring your family troubles into town." He gave Evelyn a long, leering look. "Roland ain't gonna be happy to hear this news." They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving a thick cloud of dust and an even thicker silence behind them. Lucas stood watching them go, his back rigid. When they were finally out of sight, he slowly turned to face Evelyn. "I hope that was all right," he said, his voice returning to its usual quiet tone. "You put yourself in danger," she whispered, her hands trembling. "For me. It was my fight long before you ever got here," he said grimly. He walked over to the water pump and began washing the grime from his hands. "This was never just about you, Evelyn." She followed him, needing to understand. "What did you mean? About your fight?" He looked up from the pump, water dripping from his hands. The setting sun caught his eyes, and she saw a deep, profound sadness there, a grief so old it had become a part of him. "My wife, Miriam," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "She didn't die from a fever." Evelyn waited, her heart aching for this man she barely knew. "It was Roland," he said, the words choked with a venomous hatred. "We had a dispute over a piece of land. This piece of land. He said it was his. I said it was mine. He drove her out. In the middle of the worst winter storm this county has ever seen. Told her she wasn't welcome on Tate land anymore." He clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. "I was away, trading for supplies. When I came back, she was gone. I found her 2 days later, less than a mile from here. Frozen. He killed her, Evelyn, as surely as if he'd put a gun to her head." The story hung between them, a horrifying testament to his brother's cruelty. This wasn't a lie to protect her. It was an act of war. He hadn't just claimed a wife. He had taken back a piece of what Roland had stolen from him. He had planted a flag on this small patch of land and dared his brother to come and take it. And Evelyn was that flag. That night the wind began to howl. It came out of the north, sudden and strange, rattling the windows and moaning through the cracks in the walls like a ghost. Evelyn stood at the kitchen basin, washing the dinner plates, when the first crack of thunder split the sky. She looked out the door. Lucas was already there, staring at the horizon. The sky was a terrifying swirl of bruised purple and sickly green. The storm was a monster, and it was coming for them. "Board the windows," he yelled over the rising wind. They worked together in a frantic, silent race against the approaching darkness. The wind tore at them, whipping Evelyn's hair across her face and trying to rip the heavy planks from her hands. Lightning spiderwebbed across the sky, illuminating the world in brief, terrifying flashes. They stumbled back inside just as the first wall of rain hit the cabin with the force of a tidal wave. The small room was plunged into a dim, flickering twilight, lit only by a single candle. The storm raged outside, a symphony of destruction. They sat at the table, two small figures in a vast, violent world. "I haven't liked storms since she died," Lucas said, his voice barely a whisper above the howl of the wind. "It was a night like this." Suddenly a loud thud slammed against the outside wall, making them both jump. It wasn't the sound of a branch. It was heavier, softer. Lucas grabbed the rifle he kept mounted above the door. "Stay here," he ordered. "No," she said, standing with him. "I'm not afraid." "I know," he said, his hand on the door latch. His eyes met hers, and she saw real fear in them for the first time. "But I am." He threw the door open and stepped out into the deluge. Evelyn waited, her heart pounding, counting the seconds. Then she heard a voice cut through the wind, a man's voice, cursing, shouting. And it wasn't Lucas. She ran to the door and looked out. Lucas was standing under the small porch overhang, the rifle held ready. And at his feet, slumped in the mud, was a man. His shirt was torn, blood streamed from a gash on his temple, and he was soaked to the bone. Evelyn rushed out into the rain. "Who is he?" "Don't know," Lucas grunted. "Found him stumbling toward the barn." Together, they dragged the half-conscious stranger inside and laid him on a pallet near the fire. He was younger than Lucas, with a trimmed mustache and the arrogant look of a man used to getting his way. He smelled of whiskey and desperation. As Evelyn cleaned the wound on his head, the man's eyes fluttered open. They were wild with pain and confusion until they landed on her. A crooked, charming smile spread across his lips. "Well, well," he slurred, his gaze flicking from her to Lucas, who stood in the corner like a storm cloud, the rifle still in his hand. "Did I die and go to heaven, or did I just stumble into the middle of a domestic dispute?" The stranger introduced himself as Jebediah Clay. He claimed he'd been ambushed on the trail, that he was a lawman, or had been once, a long time ago. He was a smooth talker, his words flowing like honey even as he winced in pain. He flirted openly with Evelyn, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl, all while casting wary glances at Lucas and his rifle. Lucas didn't trust him for a second. "He brings noise," he said to Evelyn when Jeb had drifted into a restless, mumbling sleep. "I built this place to be quiet." "So did I," she shot back, her patience wearing thin. Lucas's silence was one thing, but his suspicion felt like a wall between them. "You think I wanted this?" "That was different," he said. "How?" she challenged. "Because I didn't arrive with a bullet hole and a bottle of bourbon?" She stepped closer, her eyes flashing. "You don't know the first thing about the trouble I was running from. You never even asked." His face hardened, and for a second she thought he would turn away. But instead, something in him seemed to crack. "I know what happens when you let trouble in your door," he said, his voice low and raw. "Miriam, she had a cousin, showed up one night, just like this one. Said he was being chased, that he owed some men money. We took him in, we fed him. 3 days later, the men he owed came looking for him. They burned my barn to the ground." His voice broke. Miriam was inside. Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The story he'd told her before, about Roland driving Miriam out into a storm, it was a lie. Or, not the whole truth. "I'm so sorry, Lucas," she whispered. "I am not her," she added, her voice fierce. "And this is not the same." The next day, as soon as the rain stopped, Lucas saddled his horse. "I'm going to town," he said. He wasn't asking for permission. For supplies. But Evelyn knew he was lying. He was going to ask about Jebediah Clay. While he was gone, Jeb's fever broke. He sat up, clearer-eyed, and talked to Evelyn. He was charming, witty, and he spun tales of adventures in faraway places. He subtly planted seeds of doubt about her silent, brooding protector. A man that quiet, Jeb mused, watching her through narrowed eyes. A man who keeps a rifle that close. He ain't grieving a wife. He's hiding from a ghost. When Lucas returned late that night, his face was a grim, thunderous mask. He walked straight past Evelyn, kicked the door shut, and stood over the cot where Jeb was resting. "I asked around town about you," Lucas said, his voice dangerously soft. Jeb just smiled that lazy, crooked smile. "And? Did you hear any good stories?" Lucas reached into his coat and pulled out a folded, weathered piece of paper. He flicked it open. It was a wanted poster. "They're looking for you, all right," Lucas said. Evelyn leaned in to see. The drawing was crude, but it was unmistakably the man on the cot. Her eyes scanned the text, looking for the name Jebediah Clay. But that's not the name she saw. The poster was old, the paper yellowed and torn. And the name printed in bold black letters under the heading, "Wanted," for robbery and murder wasn't Jebediah Clay. It was Lucas Tate. Evelyn felt the floor drop out from under her. The room spun. The quiet man who had saved her, the grieving widower, the protector, was a wanted killer? All this time she had been living under the roof of a fugitive. The silence, the isolation, the rifle that was always within reach, it all snapped into a terrifying new focus. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. "What is this?" He didn't look at her. His eyes were locked on Jeb, who was now sitting up on the cot, a look of genuine surprise on his face. "Well, I'll be," Jeb breathed, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Looks like I'm not the only one in this cozy little cabin with a past." Lucas finally tore his gaze from Jeb and looked at Evelyn. The pain and betrayal in her eyes seemed to hit him like a physical blow. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice strained. "It was a long time ago. Robbery, murder," she choked out, holding up the poster. "This says you killed a man." "I was framed," he bit out, the words sharp with a decade of bitterness. By him. By Roland. The story tumbled out of him, a torrent of words from a man who barely spoke. 10 years ago, he and Roland had inherited the ranch together. But Roland was greedy. He'd wanted it all. He had robbed their family's own savings, a small fortune their father had hidden away, and shot a loyal ranch hand who had witnessed the theft. And he'd pinned it all on his older brother. Lucas had been forced to flee, to live under an assumed name, always looking over his shoulder. He'd only returned to this place years later because it was the only home he'd ever known, hoping his past was buried deep enough. I came back to be quiet, he finished, his voice raw with emotion. To be left alone. I never wanted. He trailed off, looking at Evelyn, his expression a mixture of desperation and despair. Before Evelyn could even process the confession, Jeb Clay let out a low whistle. Framed by your own brother. That's a cold hand to be dealt. He swung his legs off the cot and stood up, moving with a surprising agility for a man who had been at death's door just a day before. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage, and she was trapped inside with two men, both of them running from the law. Who was the bigger danger? The quiet man with a murderer's name, or the charming stranger with a silver tongue and secrets in his eyes? So what's your story, Jeb? Lucas growled, turning his suspicion on the other man. Who were you really running from? Jeb's charming smile faded. Folks a lot meaner than a local sheriff, he said, his voice suddenly hard. I used to work for a man named Abernathy, a land baron from back east. He's trying to buy up this whole valley, lock, stock, and barrel. He looked from Lucas to Evelyn. He pays men to be persuasive, and he's got a local partner helping him clear the board. A sick feeling of dread coiled in Evelyn's stomach. She already knew the answer before Jeb said the name. Roland Tate, Jeb confirmed, his eyes glinting. Your brother is selling him this entire valley, every last rancher, right out from under them. Suddenly it all made a horrifying kind of sense. Roland's need for a weak, compliant wife, someone who wouldn't ask questions when he sold off their home. The intimidation from his men, the fear in the town. It was all part of a much larger, more sinister plan. What does this have to do with you? Lucas demanded. Jeb reached down and slowly pulled a small, oilskin pouch from a hidden pocket in his boot. He tossed it onto the table. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. This, he said. Abernathy's men weren't chasing me because I deserted. They were chasing me because I stole this from them. Lucas cautiously opened the pouch. Inside was a thick, folded document. The original deed to the entire valley, dating back to the first settlers. And tucked inside it was a more recent bill of sale, an agreement to sell the entire territory to Abernathy's company. At the bottom, next to Abernathy's ostentatious signature, was another. Forged, but unmistakable. Roland Tate. This is the proof, Jeb said. The proof that can ruin them both. Your brother and his rich friend. It's what they'll kill for. Before the weight of his words could even settle, the sharp, frantic barking of the dog outside shattered the night. Lucas moved to the window, peering through a crack in the boards. His body went rigid. What is it? Evelyn whispered. He turned from the window, his face pale and grim in the candlelight. They're here, he said, and they've surrounded the cabin. The first bullet splintered the wooden door frame, showering the room with splinters. Evelyn screamed and dropped to the floor. Outside, men were shouting, their voices carried on the wind, ugly, violent sounds. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was an execution. Get down, Lucas yelled, shoving the heavy table on its side and pulling her behind it. Jeb was already there, a pistol that seemed to have appeared from nowhere in his hand. How many? Jeb asked, his voice calm and steady, all traces of the charming drifter gone. Too many, Lucas growled back, his own rifle now at his shoulder. A dozen, maybe more. The cabin became a death trap. Bullets ripped through the thin walls, shattering the few possessions Lucas owned. Glass exploded from the window frame, the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and fear. Lucas and Jeb returned fire, two cornered animals fighting with everything they had. In the midst of the chaos, Evelyn felt a strange calm settle over her. The city girl, the woman, too good for this world, was gone. In her place was someone she didn't recognize, someone forged in humiliation and hardened by fear. She wasn't screaming anymore. She was thinking. She saw the way the wind blew through the shattered window, making the candle flame dance wildly. She remembered the dry prairie grass outside, baked to tinder by the summer sun. She remembered something her father, a farmer long before he was a broken man, had once told her about fighting fires. You fight it with fire. "Lucas!" she yelled over the gunfire. "The lantern! Give me the lantern!" He looked at her, his face a mask of confusion and disbelief. "What are you doing?" "I have a plan," she screamed. "Trust me." He hesitated for only a second, then slid the heavy oil lantern across the floor. Her hands, surprisingly steady, worked the flint. She lit the wick, the flame casting a desperate, dancing light across their faces. "The back wall," she said, pointing to the side of the cabin where the wind was strongest. "They think we're trapped. They're all at the front and sides." Lucas and Jeb laid down suppressing fire, while Evelyn, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, ran to the back of the cabin. She kicked at the flimsy boards, splintering them, creating a small opening. The wind howled through it. "This is either going to save us or burn us alive," she muttered to herself. She took a deep breath, smashed the lantern against the inside wall, and threw the burning, oil-soaked rags out the hole and into the dry grass. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a terrifying whoosh, the prairie itself seemed to explode. A wall of fire erupted behind the cabin, greedily consuming the dry grass. The wind caught it, fanning it into a roaring inferno and driving it directly toward the spot where the riders were positioned. Shouts of panic and fear replaced the confident taunts from moments before. The hunters had become the hunted, trapped between the cabin and a rushing sea of flames. "Now!" Lucas yelled. They scrambled out the back, the heat of the fire scorching their skin, the thick smoke choking them. They ran, hunched low, using the chaos and the wall of smoke as cover. Behind them, the sounds of screaming men and terrified horses were swallowed by the roar of the fire. They didn't stop running until their lungs burned, and the fire was a distant, angry glow against the night sky. They stumbled through the darkness, their only goal to reach the town before Abernathy's men could regroup. It wasn't about escaping anymore. It was about exposing the truth. They arrived at the edge of town, just as the first hint of dawn was staining the eastern sky. But their relief was short-lived. A figure stepped out of the shadows of the livery stable. Roland Tate, and he wasn't alone. The sheriff and a dozen deputized townsmen stood with him, rifles in their hands. "There they are," Roland bellowed, pointing a thick finger at them. "The murderer, Lucas Tate, and his accomplice. They burned down his own cabin and tried to kill my men." The townspeople raised their rifles. Their faces were a mixture of fear and anger. They had lived under Roland's thumb for so long, they didn't know who to believe. Lucas, Evelyn, and Jeb were trapped, caught in a closing circle of guns in the middle of the main street. It was over. "It's a lie!" Lucas shouted, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "He's the criminal. He's selling you out to a land baron from the east. I have the proof." He held up the oilskin pouch containing the deed. "He's a desperate man," Roland sneered. his voice dripping with false pity. "A known killer. Would you believe him over me? Your neighbor?" The sheriff took a step forward, his gun leveled at Lucas's chest. "Drop the pouch, Lucas. It's over." The crowd murmured, their rifles wavering. They were afraid, uncertain. Roland's story was simpler. Lucas was the outsider, the ghost with a dark past. But then, a clear, steady voice cut through the tense silence. "He's not the only one with proof." All eyes turned to Evelyn. She stood tall, her face smudged with soot, her dress torn, but her eyes burned with an unshakable conviction. She held up the single creased piece of paper she had carried with her since she left Missouri. The mail-order bride letter. "This isn't a marriage proposal," she announced, her voice ringing with authority, silencing the crowd. "It's a confession." Roland laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "What is that girl talking about? It's a letter." "Look closer," Evelyn challenged, stepping forward into the center of the standoff. She held the letter up to the rising sun. "It's not just a letter, it's an invoice." She pointed to the bottom of the page. There, almost invisible against the cheap paper, was a faint watermark, an embossed seal pressed into the fiber of the page. An ornate A. "That," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper, "is the corporate seal of the Abernathy Land Company." A gasp went through the crowd. "The advertisement wasn't just to find a disposable wife," she continued, her gaze locking onto Roland, who had gone pale. "It was a coded message, wasn't it? A confirmation sent to Abernathy's men that the local landowner was dealt with and the deal was ready to close. The mail-order bride was just the final detail, the delivery receipt." The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. The townspeople looked from the seal on the letter to the pouch in Lucas's hand, then to the terrified, guilty face of Roland Tate. The lie was broken. The truth was out. The sheriff, a weather vane in the wind, slowly lowered his rifle and turned it toward a stunned Roland. The rest of the town followed suit. The tide had turned. Justice, in the dusty main street of a forgotten prairie town, was finally being served. In the aftermath, as Roland and the remnants of Abernathy's men were locked away, Jeb Clay clapped Lucas on the shoulder, gave Evelyn a respectful nod, and simply vanished into the prairie, a ghost returning to the wind. Lucas's name was cleared. The old wanted poster was torn down. He was no longer Lucas Tate, the fugitive, but Lucas Tate, the man who had saved them all, the rightful owner of the sprawling Tate Ranch. Days later, he and Evelyn stood on the porch of the main ranch house. It was a grand, empty place, haunted by the memory of a family torn apart by greed. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't a wall. It was a space they shared. "The deal we made," Lucas said quietly, not looking at her. "Wife in name only. You're free to go, Evelyn. I can give you the money for a ticket back east. You can start over." She looked out at the vast, golden land stretching before them. She thought of the woman who had stepped off the train, full of fragile hopes. She thought of the terror, the fire, the fight for her life. And she thought of the quiet man who had stood by her, who had lied for her, who had fought for her. "When you stood up to your brother's men," she said softly, "you told them I was your wife. But then you told the whole town that I was better than them. No one has ever stood up for me like that in my entire life." He finally turned to look at her, his face full of a question he was too afraid to ask. "I think I'd like to stay," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "But I don't think I want it to be in name only." For the first time since she had met him, Lucas Tate truly smiled. It transformed his face, chasing away the shadows and the grief, and revealing the good man who had been hiding there all along. They stood together, watching the sun set, two survivors who had found in the heart of violence and deceit an unexpected home. The prairie was no longer empty. It was full of promise. True strength isn't about how hard you can hit, but about how much you're willing to stand for. If you enjoyed this story of courage and justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments below. What do you think was the bravest thing Evelyn did?